Just want to remind you, there is a fourth part of this series on homelessness and refusal politics on May 18th at noon, and you'll enjoy that. Look for that. So Graham Pruss was inspired to focus on the habitation of vehicles in public space by extensive travel with his family as a kid in vehicles. And he has had close relationships with long-term vehicle residents throughout his life. He was previously a recipient of social welfare programs as a homeless youth and teen parent in the 1990s, and worked as the primary social service outreach specialist for all vehicle residents in Seattle from 2013 to 2015. He served on the executive and governing boards for the Seattle-King County Continuum of Care Coordinating Agency. At the time, it was called All Home. As you know, we now have a whole different structure. And he was co-chair of their policy committee. He's also served on the mayor of Seattle's Innovation Advisory Council and helped oversee documentation of regional vehicle residency for the annual point in time count of unsheltered people between 2017 and 2020. He got his PhD here from our UW Department of Anthropology, and he's now with the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative at the University of California, San Francisco in their Center for Vulnerable Populations. He's a postdoc scholar. And he recently has conducted research with residents of oversized vehicles in Oakland. We want to hear about that. And is coordinating the first National Vehicle Residency Summit in fall of 2022. Graham will discuss the evolution of his research from a UW undergrad project back in the day to a national body of work that improves awareness, social service planning, and legal advocacy for vehicle residents. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Are we going to be able to see him? Yeah, you're good.
Are you ready for your slideshow?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. Should I just call out when to advance?
You're going to drive it, my friend.
Okay, I can do that.
You're going to share this.
Thanks everybody for your patience as we go this road. Perfect. Look at that. Great.
And you can drive it off here.
Sure can.
Only thing you're doing on there is video.
Great. All right. Thanks everybody. I think where's the camera? So I'm looking at the camera the right way. There, it's over there. So thank you everybody for having me. It's such a pleasure. And thank you, Professor Hagopian, for the Center for Health Innovation and Policy Science for inviting me to speak today. This is my first time actually giving a talk in person since the whole COVID shutdown began in spring 2020, and actually since I was teaching here at University of Washington, lecturing here. So it's such a pleasure to see faces, even if most of them are covered. I've been studying the conditions of homelessness and using anthropology since 2009. Beginning as an undergraduate transfer student to the University of Washington from Seattle Central Community College, go Broadway University, where I was inspired, as Amy mentioned, to this work because of my experiences as an unhoused teen and as a teen parent who was dependent on social services in the 1990s. While my work has focused on the use of vehicles for long-term residency and public parking, I'm very interested, went forward a little bit there. I'm interested in stuff that's beyond this page. I'm interested in the intersection of settlement politics, of colonization, of the privatization of space, as well as displacement of people and the long-term effects of these processes and how it relates to vehicle residency. Sorry, I just added that thing that popped up. We're going to enable the transcription. I think that's right. Okay, so moving on. There we go. Okay, so we'll start with a basic overview of the presentation. We'll talk briefly about research on vehicle residency, about how that leads into public policy, social service, and legal advocacy, and then sort of how this moves forward and what is on the horizon of this research. We have a lot to cover. So if you do have any questions, please write them down. If I can provide any clarification during the course of this, raise your hand, let me know. I'm happy to answer questions. But we have a lot to cover, so I want to make sure that we have time at the end. So please hold whatever questions you might have for the end. So let's begin. So then, it's always good to start off by defining our terms. So then, what is vehicle residency? Well, to be clear, there is a difference in the quality of life and resources that are available to various forms of vehicle residency. As shown in this photograph of up to 8 vehicles that could be used as housing in Seattle. I took this photograph, in fact, I took most of the photographs you'll see today. That from vans to RVs to semi-trailers, it can be nearly impossible to parse the many reasons why a person might use a vehicle for housing solely based upon the external appearance of the vehicle. For many vehicle residents, particularly people who live in larger vehicles, such as an RV or a camper truck or a school bus, many do not consider their long-term housing as a home and do not self-identify as homeless. Simply put, I use the definition of vehicle residency, or the term vehicle residency, to mean the use of a vehicle for a primary residence, and try to use this more inclusive big tent sort of idea to bring in as many people as we can underneath that label. So why study vehicle residency? Well, the use of vehicles has, as a primary shelter, has a deep anthropological history. For as long as people have had vehicles to move around in, people have been generally occupying them. Within the United States, or within North America, for hundreds, thousands of years, people have used mobilized settlement practices, often referred to as nomadism, but large movements of people across North America. And in the post or settler colonial era and post-settler colonial era that we live in now as well, the use of vehicles has been used for the settlement across the lands in North America through the covered wagons, all the way up until we think of the 1960s and people moving into school buses. The use of vehicles as the van down by the river has a long cultural context in the North American United States. Actually, this is a photo of myself and my family as when we took the trip that Amy alluded to earlier in 1986, when I was, or 1984, when I was 6 years old. Or something like that, 8 years old. This is actually as we've just returned from the trip. Well, our family, I should be clear, we were not vehicle residents. We were tourists. We were perhaps vehicular recreationalists. There's a big difference here. I want to make sure that's clear, because what we're going to be talking about today are people who primarily use their vehicle as their primary shelter. Well, our family had already hosted a close family friend who lived in his camper on our property for several years and would after this as well. The experiences of traveling across the US in an RV introduced me to a lifelong interest in vehicle residency. And then, and also, I should say that considering that these adaptive strategies of homemaking, how people use homes and make homes as adaptive strategies can help to show the environmental and socioeconomic determinants of these human behaviors, so that we can help to understand the larger implications and contexts of these shelters and the use of shelter. So who are vehicle residents? Well, increasingly across the United States, people are using vehicle residency to navigate persistent forces of displacement, from economic barriers and opportunities, such as rising incomes and the cost of housing that are not rising, the rising incomes that are not matched for all people. In Seattle, we're probably very aware of companies like Amazon, and that we've seen increasing incomes, and that people not all have that and cannot meet the high rising costs of rent. Amazon also employs a large group of vehicle residents as part of their camper force, who works as the annual shipping of products during the holiday season and after the Black Friday season. And so there's for people who are displaced from their communities and are working in those types of economies, to people who have been socially excluded or systemically excluded from our communities, people who have undocumented immigration status, or may have families or individuals that may not be able to access social services or shelters, to people who are fleeing natural disasters, such as recent fires across the West Coast, hurricanes, large-scale displacements. In fact, after the recent fires in California, many communities, I was down there actually at the time, the streets were virtually flooded with RVs of people who had lived in local housing and were fortunate enough to actually have an RV or a van to move into afterwards. Many of those people are still living in those vehicles at this time. And for more and more Americans are turning to vehicle residency as a form of affordable housing. Sometimes referred to as van life or RV life, it can be difficult sometimes to parse out or distinguish between these. And this is why this issue of homelessness often comes up and is contentious. For some people, it is using a vehicle is seen as a last resort. For some people, it is people use a vehicle for migratory labor. Some people use it as a way, as a step up from living between public spaces and private spaces. While again, many people do not self-identify, who are living in vehicles do not self-identify as homeless. According to US federal definitions, anybody who is occupying a vehicle in public spaces is likely to be determined as homeless and to be counted during point-in-time counts as unsheltered. So we're going to talk about a few things during the course of this presentation, but I want to give sort of the takeaway early on so that you'll see these themes, I think, represented consistently. One is that a growing class of people on limited or fixed incomes have been displaced and are being disconnected from their communities because they cannot afford rising costs of housing and living. And there was a recent book, I'm sure several of us are familiar, by Greg Colburn here at the University of Washington that showed this specifically. This is something I've seen throughout my research as well. The second point is that people rely on vehicles as long-term privately owned shelters to access their available resources, employment systems, hygiene and waste services, medical and social service systems of care. And often that these are within their communities. And the third point is that vehicle residents who have few options but to sleep in public spaces when healthy private spaces are unavailable or inaccessible. And that seems to be the case in many, many communities. We'll talk a little bit about that. There we go. So let's take vehicle residency as actually as Amy really excellently introduced, has a long history that intersects with colonization, with privatization and displacement. For example, let's consider vehicle residency in North America with the Irish and British travelers, the experiences and histories of the travelers. The travelers were a community, or are a community, that was initially displaced over 400 years ago by the British government during its colonization of Ireland and Scotland, as well as the enclosure of commonly held lands and subsequent displacement of the original inhabitants of those spaces. Throughout the next 4 centuries, the population of internally displaced people grew due to conflict, due to famine, and further evictions. And they survived in public spaces using mobile shelters and using the resources that they were able to scrap or collect from the settled communities. So you can see on the left-hand photo here is a traveler encampment with a bender tent and a vardo or caravan that people are living in, 1910. And on the right hand is an image of a man doing scrapping and metalworking of recycled metals. And this may, if you're familiar with vehicle residency or unhoused communities, these are behaviors that we see often, and often among so-called nomadic communities, because they're a way of reclaiming resources that are otherwise discarded from settled communities to make money with and to provide it. So sorry, we got a anti-virus thing on that. Hopefully okay. So travelers developed settlement sites on the peripheries of cities until they were forced to move along. Again, you see this within North American vehicle residents. And all of these are adaptive responses to environmental forces, again, all familiar with vehicle residents in North America. The British and Irish governments have been working since the 1960s to help resettle this itinerary group with mixed success. And I suggest that we consider how we view these photographs and those in my research that I've showed and will show further, that we reconsider them. For example, what may appear as refuse in often makeshift shelters or piles of scrapping materials are important possessions of people within this constrained environment. The image on the right, which is called a halting site, which is very similar to what are now called safe parking programs in the United States, was developed. In that site, you can see piles of scrap metal on the left-hand side. These are used as recycling and were used by people to for economic gain. We see on the left-hand side a mapping of the settlement patterns of the traveler communities at this time in Dublin, Ireland, and how they're on the circle ring on the periphery of the city. And I'll come back to that just here in a moment, because while there is a considerable amount of harm that surrounds vehicle residents, particularly in public space, it is important to note that people use their vehicles to create safe home spaces within the public realm. Communities form of people people who are pushed out, and in their isolation and shared adversity, they often form a cultural unity. This increases the perceived value of vehicle residence as a resistance to the systemic disconnection of the community, and as well as an optimal choice of housing among their severely limited options. As sociologist Michelle Wakin noted in one of the only other studies on vehicle residency, vehicle homes offer a transformative potential of homemaking as acts of resilience within environmental restrictions on housing. And again, I encourage us to reconsider this image here. The colored one in the middle is actually of vehicle residencies in downtown Seattle in the Soto area. And while we might see vehicles with a lot of stuff, maybe even seen as garbage, if we think about how these objects are used, there are objects that are from ladders to bicycles to storage containers. These are used for people to travel, to hold their possessions, and also for economic production. So again, I think that this is a good example of how what we see from the outset might appear to be sort of abject poverty, but in many ways it's a way of persons holding together their possessions that are vital for their lives and to thrive. So I use ethnoarchaeological methods to conduct research with people who use vehicles as primary housing. Ethnoarchaeology is a strategy that combines ethnographic techniques to study cultural behaviors with archaeological techniques to study how people manufacture, use, and dispose of objects. For example, I recently returned from ethnographic field research with people living full-time in vehicles outside of cities. In the winter, thousands of vehicle residents visit the southwestern states, the United States, such as Arizona, to boondock or live without electricity and water connections, such as those featured in the photo on the left. And that was actually, I think, taken from this year of where I was at down in Arizona. On the right, we can see a map. I'm going to talk both about these more in a moment, but of the settlements. We conducted settlement mapping in the Ballard area, and you can see the densities of these communities on there. Again, I'll discuss this in just one moment. This is an example of how we combine these two. So I began investigating vehicle residency in 2010, shortly after the Great Recession and at the start of another economic boom in Seattle. I chose the North Seattle neighborhood of Ballard as my first study site because I had lived and worked alongside many vehicle residents in the area for years. These maps provided here on the left and in the middle by the Seattle Department of Transportation in 2012 show the placement of no parking 2 to 5 a.m. signs throughout Ballard and the rest of the city. I focused on the placement of these overnight parking restrictions and the larger effects of spatial control on the settlement patterns of vehicle residents. And you can see actually in the, we'll talk more about how these signs work, but the red dots on these maps are where the no parking signs were placed in 2012. And you can see these are generally placed in locations that where vehicle residents had been living in public space. This actually, the map on the left, is essentially a map of the displacement of vehicle residents because those signs were placed in areas to remove people who were living in vehicles from those spaces. Since then, those signs have been very widely installed across the city. So this information is a bit old at this point. Yeah. So I began the mapping for this study grew out of a University of Washington statistics course, actually an extra credit project for a statistics course here at UW, to count something periodically within our environment. This slide shows an early example of one of those maps. This is actually how we developed the maps, produced during the first year of our study. Our research team did not collect license plate or identifying information and studied areas that were reported to me by parking enforcement officers as previously known for high frequencies of vehicle residency. We took this precaution to protect the privacy, the safety, and avoid alerting authorities to unknown locations of vulnerable people. And over the course of 3 years, our 8 teams of University of Washington and Seattle University students mapped actually, I think, 24 periods of settlement patterns across North Seattle, actually, and SoDo as well. So this is just the first year of the pattern study. And our goal of this was to develop a responsible methodology for documenting vehicle residency, to identify a vehicle as being lived in, and to record the number and type of vehicle residencies in our study area. So we developed this identification system during the course of our study that was implemented from during the 2017, actually up through the 2022 point in time counts of unsheltered people throughout King County. Our system has since been sought by the U.S. Census Bureau to inform and improve their 2030 census. So this is moving this beyond here too. I'm happy to talk about this further if anyone has any questions on any of this, but these are just some basic, the system was that if the vehicle exhibits 3 of these 6 characteristics, we would count it as being lived in. And the goal of this is actually so that you can identify the vehicle from a block away without making contact with the inhabitant and still with high degree of accuracy identify the vehicles as being currently inhabited. So going back to this map, when compared with the legal restrictions on space, we can see how dense settlements patterns developed within the available overnight parking for vehicle residents. Together, these systems of overnight parking laws constrain people and force people who sleep in vehicles to occupy the most industrially polluted, unpoliced, and resource-deficient places in our communities. Specifically, there's a law in Seattle, and this is true in many communities, that an oversized vehicle or a vehicle that's over 80 inches wide must park overnight in industrial areas. This is why you tend to see RVs parked in the industrial parts of Ballard or in the SoDo area. On this map here, the pink zone here is the industrial zoned area of Ballard. And the yellow highlighted streets are streets that have a no parking 2 to 5 a.m. sign on them. So what we're seeing here is the overlap of restrictions upon this area. Again, this was in 2012. And the red lines here are the where people were living in vehicles. The thicker the line, the higher density of people were living in vehicles at those nights. And we can see, if we sort of highlight where those are, is that these areas are located between these heavily constrained streets, and really that people are using these sort of remaining islands of legal space to survive within this highly constrained area. In these few remaining legal spaces, consistent waves of legal warnings and tickets further destabilize vehicle residents, contributing to their property loss and trauma. Seattle University and the National Homelessness Law Center reported in 2014 that laws and parking enforcement which criminalize vehicle residency are the fastest growing policies and practices targeting unsheltered communities in the USA. Ultimately, this hostile environment towards vehicle residents increases law enforcement costs and difficulty for social service providers to maintain necessary contact with people who may want housing. This map shows some of the results of the settlement mapping in North Seattle, demonstrating how the densities of vehicle residency develop in these unrestricted areas. Far from curbing vehicle residency, without an outlet for these homes, these restrictions have condensed their occupation of remaining space. We can see how these numbers actually do not go down. Despite these increasing restrictions on public parking, vehicle residency has represented at least 30% of King County's total unsheltered population for over a decade. By 2018, 53% of people who slept in public spaces across King County inhabited vehicles. And yet, while approximately 3,500 people occupied King County's emergency and transitional shelter system, there was space for less than 100 vehicle residents funded in the local continuum of care. In comparison, King County's emergency shelter system received roughly $31 million in funding during this time, while vehicle residency-oriented programs received roughly $350,000 in funding. You might ask, why is it that over half of the people who sleep in public spaces throughout King County receive so little funding very little advocacy, and almost no specific assistance to help them to stabilize. Moreover, why has this growing population of vehicle residents been targeted with open legal discrimination and exclusion? So in 2020, as Amy mentioned, I accepted a fellowship to continue my research at the University of California, San Francisco as a postdoctoral scholar at the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative in the Center for Vulnerable Populations. I have conducted primarily qualitative research with unhoused communities and with vehicle residents. We use a strategic science approach that works alongside communities with lived experience, with service providers and policymakers to conduct research designed to inform public policy and program development. We'll switch gears now to discuss some of our most recent research with residents of oversized vehicles who lived in public spaces in Oakland, California. And so a little bit of background just on vehicle residency in Oakland. There's a lot of numbers here. We can come back to this. We don't have to go all through this right now. But across the Bay Area, vehicles are the most common form of non-congregate shelter used by people who are unhoused or homeless. The city of Oakland staff observed an increase in vehicle residency of oversized vehicles during the COVID-19 pandemic from approximately 700 to over 1,000 vehicles in public parking in Oakland. In spring 2021, the city of Oakland staff reached out to us at the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative to learn more about residents of oversized vehicles. Oh, I can still hear it. So, can you all hear me still?
Oh, good.
Okay, good.
Great.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. Let's see. So they wanted to learn more about residents of oversized vehicles, about their housing needs, about service utilization, and preferences regarding existing and proposed parking programs. I worked with colleagues at the BHHI, such as Drs. Kelly Knight and Dr. Margot Kuchel, to develop and conduct the COVID-19 oriented oversized vehicle resident assessment, or COROVA study. We had to come up with a nice acronym there. And our study aimed to inform the development of interventions and programs to better incorporate residents of oversized vehicles into local continuums of housing, social services, and medical care. The one thing I just note on this is that, I don't know if you had a time to read through any of this information, but you may notice that vehicles are the #1 or within the top 3 forms of shelter that were counted in the point time counts, the column on the left, and that vehicles on average represent 36% and a median of 41% of unsheltered people in the 9 Bay Area counties. In some counties, like San Mateo, 75% of people who are unsheltered are living in vehicles. So in Alameda County and in Oakland, both in the city and the county, 45% of the unsheltered population recorded during the 2009 point-in-time count resides in vehicles. Vehicle residents, as we sort of talked about, live in smaller vehicles such as cars, vans, and camper trucks, or they might live in these oversized vehicles, such as an RV, trailer, school bus, or commercial-sized truck. In California, the vehicle code defines oversized vehicles as over 25 feet long, 80 inches wide, or 82 inches tall. And there are very similar regulations around parking in industrial zones like we see in Seattle. 50% of vehicle residents living in Oakland's public parking are living in these oversized vehicles. So that's why we focused on these vehicles in particular. So for our study, we conducted 48 in-depth interviews with residents of oversized vehicles parked in public spaces. Specifically, they were not in parking programs because we asked about why people didn't want to use parking programs. We interviewed people at 5 sites across Oakland, primarily in West Oakland, using convenience and snowball sampling of knocking on doors and asking people to introduce us to other possible interviewees. Our qualitative study was designed to provide insights into concerns, attitudes, and preferences around services. It was not quantitative, and so in that way, we were not designed to provide estimates of proportions or demographics. The people that we met, and if you want to read through this, you can, read it in a sec, but the people that we met had lived in the local area where our studies were conducted for the majority of their lives and moved into their vehicles as a more affordable form of housing within their familiar community. As one study participant, Alyssa, explained, residents of oversized vehicles in Oakland are a diverse community that are proud of their privately owned shelters. As Alyssa said, Oakland is a great city to live in. It's really diverse, and I was able to work here with a feeling of not being judged and biased attitudes toward me as an African-American woman. Because of that, it means a lot to me to be here in Oakland, living in my camper. As little and old as it is, I'm still proud of what I have. I own it. It's mine. I paid for it. I don't have a problem with it, you know? Don't look at everyone who's in their camper like they're nothing, or they don't have anything, or they're not educated, or they don't have any sense. It's not like that for a lot of people that are in their camper. Some people are here because of their income, their health. There's all different types of situations that play into why people are here. That's the one thing I would like to say. Just because they're in a camper doesn't mean that they're on drugs. If they are, look into the reasons why they are. Everyone has a story, and they can't just fit everyone's story like it's just one person. It's different. It's individuality. It's the truth. So, getting into the data. We saw several themes in our study about housing preferences, as well as engagement with social services and health care. So our study participants preferred staying in their oversized vehicles to sleeping in a congregate shelter or in other unsheltered settings, which may not be all that surprising. Our participants did not trust programs such as rapid rehousing for fear that they would return to homelessness after their temporary subsidies ended. They were not willing to give up their vehicles for this temporary housing subsidy or for temporary rental support. The majority of our study participants preferred permanent housing, but they simply could not afford the high rising cost of rent and living. A minority of the study participants did prefer actually to stay in their vehicle among housing options, but again, those housing options, permanent housing, simply didn't exist. In our study, we saw that participants had limited engagement with social services and healthcare, including outreach. The participants lacked understanding of the eligibility requirements or of the availability of current operating safe parking programs, and that participants expressed a reluctance to seek social services or healthcare due to fears of consequences from leaving their vehicles exposed in public space. Things like tickets, towing, loss of property, vandalism, or theft. How am I time? Because I don't see my clock on this. Okay, good. Okay, we'll get through this quickly then. So we should have time for questions. And so our study led to a few key recommendations to better include residents of oversized vehicles in local systems of housing and care. We recommended that communities consider expanding parking programs as a form of non-congregate shelters, that safe parking programs should be offered housing-directed services, but at the same time, that the providers of those programs need to understand that a vehicle resident may lack the enthusiasm for transition into short-term or temporary subsidies, that these programs may need to be indefinite that way. And ultimately, that the communities should be identifying sites and conducting feasibility studies about a proposed rental parking program model, which is essentially a low-income mobile home park for vehicle residents to obtain rental lessee rights. And that would be exploring the costs, the regulatory structures, the funding, as well as opportunities for private and public property management around this. This is an actually pretty attractive model to many cities because it allows them to operate these sorts of programs without having a heavy social service involvement as well. It's much more about providing a space for the vehicle as housing. So, what we saw was that our study participants tend to be displaced and living on limited or fixed incomes that were insufficient to afford the local costs of housing and living. Our study participants used vehicles as long-term shelters to maintain connections with familiar communities, with economies, and systems of care. Past studies with nomadic communities have referred to this as being tethered to a settlement to engage in their economies. This is in contrast with untethered or untied nomadic communities that move around the world to locate new potential resources in response to environmental conditions and constraints. So then, moving ahead, my research shows that people that are inhabiting their vehicles as an adaptive form of long-term shelter among these consistent socioeconomic constraints on their access to private property. They tend to see their vehicle as a more stable and preferable form of shelter than temporary or restrictive shelter options. In this way, vehicle residents are using their private property to solve a housing crisis. Because they have no place to park their vehicles in private space, a growing number of North American vehicle residents have no option but to inhabit public parking. My work with vehicle residents continues to expand to include larger tents in larger camps. But how can communities better incorporate the diversity and innovation of vehicle residents to inform public policy, social services, and legal advocacy? Moving ahead, my goal is to bring together this diverse community to share their knowledge, their perspectives, their resources, and advocacy at a national level. That includes, I recently conducted ethnographic research this winter, as I mentioned, with vehicle residents in the Arizonan Sonoran Desert, with such individuals and families living in school buses at the annual Schoolypalooza gathering. This self-organized event brought together approximately 2,000 people in an isolated Bureau of Land Management area who primarily lived off the grid using solar panels and packed all of their waste up when the event was completed. Actually, my vehicle is in this picture on the far left. I stayed in my vehicle for about 2 months as I went down on this trip. And I was also able to attend the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous in Quartzsite, Arizona, an event recently made famous in the film Nomadland. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but Bob Wells, who's in that film, is now joining our work. And actually, right in the middle of this photo, that guy standing on the stage is Bob Wells. So there's a whole bunch of people here who are actively hanging on every word of Bob. This community is primarily older, white women who are living in minivans, and there's some really interesting reasons for that we can talk about as well. Who attended this event to listen to lectures by Bob Wells to the members of the Home on Wheels Alliance and to share their tips for healthy living. And vehicle residents showed off their homes during these events, demonstrating the amazing diversity, care, and love that was invested into these shelters. I wondered, what can our communities and policymakers learn from our neighbors who live in vehicles? These are amazing. This is only a very small sample of some of the vehicles that I was able to take photos of. It's amazing to see, and people really spend a lot of time setting up their homes to be able to share with them. So I really enjoyed the beauty of that. So, almost done. So I am currently working with the National Homelessness Law Center to organize as Amy mentioned, the first National Vehicle Residency Summit. Our goal is to elevate the experiences and inclusion of vehicle residents in public policy, in program development, and legal advocacy at a national level. We started with organizing 3 work groups, similar to the 3 legs of a stool, that build toward our summit this coming November. Our teams are meeting monthly to coordinate these events. Please contact me afterwards if you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to attend, or if you'd like to join in any of our work groups or the planning for the summit. And vehicle residents ultimately are innovating, as I mentioned, an adaptive response to conditions and constraints on housing. Rather than being seen as oppositional, this innovation should be brought in to expand our systems of housing and care. Communities are developing emergent responses to local vehicle residency, such as the vehicular residency program, vehicular residential program in Oakland, which recently came out in response or as part of the study that we did, where people are able to rent a piece of their private property to place an RV as an accessory dwelling unit. Another example is the Park Village in the upper right in Sebastopol, California, where a social service provider has actually rented out a portion of spaces in a mobile home park to so that people who are living in vehicles can move their vehicles in that spot. And then the service providers actually bring case management and social services to the rest of the members of that park as well, not just the people who are participating in the program. In the lower right, the Kipling Automotive Group in North Carolina is a car dealership that actually has opened up some of their spaces to be occupied by people living in vehicles overnight who provide security to watch over their space, to make sure that it's safe. And the RV pump out program in the bottom right here in Seattle, Washington is an innovative program where a septic dump truck drives around and actually empties out the septic tanks of RVs in downtown Seattle. And actually there's some research here at the University of Washington around that's going on too. It's pretty great. And these responses, among many others, can help to better inform other communities in developing programs that include a diversity of vehicle residents and their varying needs. So thank you again for your time and attention today. I hope that you learned something about our neighbors who live in vehicles, and I hope that you were inspired to look into some of these challenges I discussed even further, and to lean in where you can to advocate for and to assist people who live in vehicles. Please reach out to me if you would like to learn anything more about what we did reviewed today. I would love to schedule a conversation to discuss this further with you. And so does anybody have any questions about this research, about vehicle residency, or maybe how you might get involved further?
Terrific presentation, by the
Thank
way.
you.
Very, very good. Jessica Bruder, who wrote the book Nomadland, it's an extraordinary book. If you haven't read it, the movie is great too, but the book is very good. And she has expressed, of course, she obviously fell in love with many of these people that she got to know. And as you say, they're an older crowd. And these are folks who are still mentally and intellectually intact, physically able to travel all over the country and do hard labor. I mean, the work that they do is not necessarily easy stuff, and seasonal, and it's intermittent and so on. So they're very resilient. But she expressed her concern, and of course, just I think 2 days ago in the New York Times, there was a huge article on the graying of the homeless population. And she said, a lot of these people that she got to know and cares about it, they're already in their 60s and 70s and some even in their 80s. And she said, I keep wondering what's going to happen when they can no longer do what they're doing. The resilience that they have that depends on their intellectual and physical strength. When that begins to dissipate, what's going to, do you have any sense yourself is there anything at all being done to anticipate this? Because we're not doing a great job on any level of the homeless question.
That an excellent point. And for anyone who couldn't hear, the question was basically about Jessica Bruder's work on Nomadland, and about that she points out that, like I mentioned in this, that many vehicle residents are older, often women who are, and there was a recent New York Times article about the graying of the homeless communities. This is something that I saw very much throughout this research, and definitely when I was in the Rubber Trap Rendezvous, I came to see it as we might think of as a boomer bomb. That we have the baby boomer generation. Many are entering into the age of Social Security, and for people who either because of a historic gender wage inequity gap, or because people tuned on and dropped out, right, and didn't take on formal labor. Many people do not have either the savings, the retirement, or the investment into Social Security, so that when they're hitting their age of receiving Social Security, they're receiving a very bare minimum. And this is something we saw a lot. It's something I've heard Bob Wells talk about, and something I've heard from many people living in their vehicles, that an increasing number of particularly women are looking at how do they live at 70 years old, how do they live for the next 20 years of their lives off $500 a month, and unable to really see that as sustainable. They're moving into vehicles, particularly minivans, for long-term housing. This is why when the topic of this presentation as the nomadic turn, this is what I'm talking about, is that what we're seeing is because of these long-term constraints on housing, and part of that includes the limitations of fixed incomes of Social Security and SSDI, that